To our new fall webinar series. Special welcome to anyone who has not learned with us before here at JTS. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement, and it has been for a long time and is only becoming more and more really a core part of JTS's mission to share the incredible resource of our outstanding faculty with the community at large. So we have loved doing this webinar series that we started really a year and a half ago, just a few weeks into the pandemic. And so pleased that so many of you have been learning with us for all of that time or have joined us at some point during the way. And again, a special welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time today. So we're kicking off a new series today. And, you know, the pandemic has so many things about each person's individual circumstances became so exaggerated during the pandemic. You know, the nature of your work or not work really defined your life. Are you an essential worker? Can you work from home? You know, are you retired? And what were you therefore doing with your time? And how does that impact you? So our jobs have always been have always played a defining role in our lives. But I think much of that defining role really has been exaggerated over the last year and a half. And many people have been thinking about, is this what I want to be doing with my time? Do I want to explore different avenues? So that was some of the inspiration for the theme for this fall's series, which we're calling 6 Days Shall You Labor, Perspectives on Work in Jewish Text and Tradition. So we'll be looking at just the whole idea of work. And of course, we have in Judaism really this core construct of Shabbat, so work versus rest. And that's where we'll be beginning today. But we'll also be looking at a variety of jobs that Jews have done over the course of our history across time and space and gender and various other factors that led Jews in different directions. We'll be looking at Jewish labor movements and all kinds of other thinking about the nature of work. So that's where we are beginning today. And we're so pleased to have Professor David Kraemer kicking us off once again. Dr. Kraemer, you always anchor us so well, all the series that you've begun for us. So before we begin, I want to thank so much our generous sponsor for today, who is George A. Goldberg, MD, in loving memory of his parents, Janet Kesselman Goldberg and Max J. Goldberg, MD. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldberg, for sponsoring today in memory of your parents. And we hope that their memories of blessing, and I'm sure that today's session will be a testament to their legacy. And if anyone else is feeling inspired to partner with us in this outstanding opportunity to learn with JTS faculty by sponsoring a learning session, we have 3 sponsorship levels now. We have Chacham for $540, Tzaddik for $1,000, and Navi for $1,800. And you can learn more by contacting learninglives@jtsa.edu. We thank you again, Dr. Goldberg, for sponsoring at the Chacham level. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Tani Schwartz-Herman, who does the hard work of putting these series together, to give us some instruction and introduce Professor Kraemer.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Also so pleased to be kicking off our fall series. And just to review the process for the Q&A, Dr. Kraemer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We also have time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your question to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Kraemer. For any technical or logistical questions, you can initiate a private chat with either myself or Stacy Firestone. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for this session. We'll also be screen sharing the sources as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Kraemer, who, as Rabbi Andelman had said earlier, many of you have had the privilege of learning with several times in our Monday webinar series. Dr. David Kraemer is director of the library at JTS. where he has also served as a professor of Talmud and Rabbinics for many years. As librarian, Professor Kraemer oversees the most extensive collection of Judaica, both rare and contemporary, in the Western Hemisphere. Professor Kraemer is a prolific author and commentator, and you can see several of his published books in the bio on the sources that were shared with you for this session. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kraemer.
Okay, am I unmuted? Yes, okay, great. First of all, Dr. Goldberg, thank you for sponsoring this. Julia, I didn't know that it costs only $1,800 to become a prophet. If I had known that, I would have invested a long time ago. Although I'm curious what the reliability of the investment is, at least for the attainment to prophecy. It's great to see all of you. We've got a large number of people. That's fantastic. I don't know if you noticed, but I've noticed that Rabbi Andelman, you are in a different setting than you have been over the course of these several series. You're actually in your office here at 3080, which is great. And Tani, I believe you are too, right? So today is the day that JTS has come back in person to campus. And I've got to say, for those of you who have been hearing about the new JTS campus, one of the central features of it is an atrium, a large community space that is meant, but was built with the intention of bringing the community together. And I've got to say, I was down there earlier, just passing through to the library, and I was so excited to see so many people there. It was really buzzing in the best sense of the word. So that was wonderful. And I hope that you will all have a chance to visit us in the not too distant future. We're not quite open to the public yet. We still have COVID restrictions, but God willing, it won't be too long before conditions open up enough so that we can welcome others as well onto campus. So our topic, the topic of this series is 6 days you shall labor. And then subtitle, that is also the main title of what I will be doing today, because this is based upon a verse that I'm sure that many of you know. 6 yamim ta'avod v'asita kol melachtecha. 6 days you shall do, ta'avod. So let's translate it. We've translated in the title as labor, and do all of your work. But the verse then goes on to say, that 7th day is Shabbat l'Adonai Elecha, right? So 6 days you labor and do your work, and then comes Shabbat, which is devoted to God, or is God's, is another way of thinking about it. I draw our attention to the verse only because it's impossible to escape this nexus. When one discusses work Jewishly, one must discuss Shabbat, and vice versa. I mean, the meaning of Shabbat, which on some level is the negation of work, the not doing of work. The question then is, what is it that you're not supposed to do? And that is what we're going to explore today, and we're going to explore it in order to get a sense of what work may mean or may have meant. And there's not only one definition of anything, so we will certainly have to keep our minds open. But what does work mean in the context of the length of Jewish tradition? That's the question we're going to be asking today by looking at certain teachings relating to Shabbat. Before we jump into that, and I will share sources with you, let me just say a few things. First of all, on the practical level, Tani and Julia, this is for you. Though we ordinarily have a period of presentation followed by questions, there is one point here where I'm going to ask for feedback to the text that I'm showing in a kind of more active classroom way. People will put their responses into the chat, but that won't be questions as such, so much as ideas that I'll be inviting people to share. So, I'll announce when that time comes, but be aware that it will be coming. So what's work? I think Rabbi Endelman, the way you began was very appropriate because you drew attention to the fact that during the pandemic, work has been, first of all, very different from the way it was before the pandemic for many, many people, for many of us who are still working. In addition, of course, there were those for whom work could not be entirely different. People who were described as essential workers that had different meanings in different places, depending upon what your work has been. You may or may not have been able to, may or may not have had the safety and luxury of withdrawing to your home and working via computer, online, having meetings via Zoom or some other platform. I mean, imagine going to our ancestors, even of the not too distant past, and saying, okay, I sit around all day in a chair and I look at something called a screen and I push a lot of buttons and this is my work and it's really exhausting and I don't know, and I need a drink at the end of the day. And they would look at us and say, what, are you crazy? You call that work and for that you need a drink? I only draw attention. I'm not saying it's not work. I'm only saying if they heard us making such a claim, they would be puzzled in the extreme. Work also, interestingly, and this is something else that's been highlighted by the pandemic, work has a geography. And the geography of work has changed over the course of time. And it's worth our noting that as well, because you know, we have been accustomed to separating our workspaces from our leisure spaces, from our home spaces, from our family spaces. And that was wiped out for many people, certainly not for all people, but for many people during the pandemic. We retreated into our homes. You know, if you were fortunate enough to have few enough people or enough rooms, you know, one person was assigned one room, another person was assigned another room. And that was the place where you would look at screens and push a lot of buttons in the description that I used before. But if we go back to pre-recent modern times, and this is very clear from traditional Jewish sources, the rabbinic sources are the ones I know best on this, but it's also true from archaeology in the land of Israel and elsewhere, I should add, but we know it from the land of Israel in connection to our sources. Over the course of many generations, centuries, the place of work and the place of residence overlapped in very significant ways. One might even say completely. And this was not true only for women, though it was particularly true for women. Ironically, when we read sources that indicate that women should remain in the so-called domestic realm, first of all, that doesn't mean that the only work that women did was domestic work, the way we use that phrase, although women did do domestic work. What's interesting is that women did all kinds of work. Some of that work, women, but also men, took place in the courtyards around which homes were structured in ancient Palestine and elsewhere, courtyards being protected settings where you could do work and have your life and then go out. But interestingly, archaeology has shown that where the place of business, the place of commerce was the shuk, and some of you will know this if you have parents or grandparents, depending upon how old you are, you may even have witnessed this quite directly yourselves and participated in it, where the home was above the shop. Right? So you had a grocery store, the family had a grocery store, and that was on the first level, and the home was on the second level. And so the separation of home and work was only very, very minimal. Interestingly, archaeology of Palestine in the ancient world shows us that there were private dwellings. You probably had to pay premium money for them that opened not only on one side to the courtyard, but had openings that allowed them to open into the shuk itself. Right, so one side is private home and courtyard, the other side was onto the shuk, and that way you could literally set up a counter, set up a table, and conduct your affairs, conduct your business with people who were going back in the shuk. I share these details, and I could get into many, many more, just in order to confound our way of thinking about work, what it is, where it takes place, and so forth. Work as we know it is a product more of technology than anything else. If any of you have ever had the occasion of reading the wonderful, very fat volume called Gotham, I'm not remembering the author at this moment, but it's a history of New York City from its beginnings until the end of the 19th century. And when the trains and streetcars connected downtown to uptown, and uptown then meant anything above 14th Street. But when, when the technology made possible the traveling back and forth, a business district was created, and it made possible living in one place and working in another. And it defined work in very different ways than work had been defined in the past. One last thing. We are accustomed to thinking of work as something that can be grueling and difficult. Some of you may have heard the claim that leisure is a modern notion, that what we do on Shabbat and what we mean by leisure, these are different things. And I think to some degree this is true, but if one dives into the kind of work that typified traditional societies, one will find that people often didn't work very hard. There were seasons when you had to work very, very hard, when the harvest was being brought in, when the market was filled with all kinds of things that typically it wasn't filled with. But again, depending upon what you did, there would be long periods of time, and it could be months out of the year, where your work was, in terms of its timing, very restricted. A couple of hours a day with a lot of sitting around, eating hummus, drinking tea, smoking whatever you smoked. And that also was a work day. So I hope all of this gives you some pictures of work in the present and in the past, of where it takes place, of how demanding it is. And I think that these references will help us to appreciate what we see in the sources that we will consider. So that's all very quick introduction. I'm going to take a minute and see if there's any question about that. Anybody want to say something, ask a question before I go on to the specific business at hand? No.
I only had a couple of questions already come in, but I think that there are things that you're going to get to. So
Okay, good. So let's hold them then, and we'll go on. So let's talk about Shabbat then. Before looking at the sources, I want to say something about the way Shabbat has been studied, the way Shabbat has been taught, in order to prepare you for what it is that we're going to see. There are some common wisdoms about Shabbat that I suspect many of you know. One of the most common wisdoms about Shabbat is that the labors that are forbidden on Shabbat are the labors that were part of the construction of the tabernacle back in the desert. So what was necessary to construct the tabernacle, those are the labors that were not permitted to do on Shabbat. That is an ancient connection. It is a well-known connection. I think that part of its popularity is on account of the considerable popularity and influence of Abraham Joshua Heschel's book on the Sabbath, which my guess would be many of you have read in the past. It's a relatively short book, and in Heschel's typical fashion, it's seductively poetic. I mean, his capacity with the English language, though it wasn't his first language, is really quite extraordinary. And so I remember, just speaking for myself, the first time I read that book, being very inspired not just by Shabbat, which is his primary discussion, but just inspired by Jewish tradition in general. What kind of tradition could have something this wonderful, was the way I responded. Saying that, though, I do want to say that there are other interpretations of Shabbat, and it is crucial that we bear those in mind. And I will say, some of you may have taken other classes with me in the past. I'm actually critical of Heschel's approach to Shabbat. I think he leaves out some key elements, and as a result, while he captures something, what he doesn't capture is as important as what he does capture. And I think it's therefore very important to expand his approach into something much broader. And you'll see that that is what we will do as we go forward. So I'm going to begin with the primary text that we will be studying together. Where is my share screen? There it is. And where is my text? Here we go, and I hit share, and it should be on your screen, and I'm gonna expand it so you can see more of it. Have I just done that? And can you see it okay? Tani, I can see. Is it on the screen in front of everybody? You can see it well?
We can see it.
Okay, great. So the probably the most important rabbinic text that pertaining to Shabbat is the one you see in front of you. It's Mishna Shabbat 7.2. We'll dive into the details of it in a moment, although I'm sure that given the fact that it's on your screen and you can't keep your eyes from reading it while I'm speaking, you're looking at it as I speak. Let me just say, to put this in perspective, the verse that is quoted in the title for these sessions is Sheshe Yamim Ta'avod, right, with the word avodah, that's the Hebrew root. Vasita kol melachtecha b'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Adonai Elohecha. Right, so 6 days you shall do avodah, whatever that word means, and then on the seventh day you shall rest. But then it goes on, Lo ta'asu kol melacha, don't do any milacha. So the two words that are used that we translate either as labor, as work, and actually it's in the first part of the verse itself, Sheshi yamim ta'avod vasita kol melachtecha, right? 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. What's the difference between avodah and melacha? Given particularly the fact we know that avodah, though in modern Hebrew it means work, in pre-modern Hebrews, the word avodah means service more than it does work. So an eved is a slave, for example, one who serves, or a servant if you prefer, and avodah is often used in connection to the sacrificial service in the temple. So the word there that I would cast under a question mark is the word avodah, and the word that seems to mean work as we use it, at least most directly or most exclusively to mean work as we use the term, is not the word avodah, but the word malacha. The problem is that the word malacha is never defined. We have to gain its, our understanding of it from its usage. And the references, and they're not infrequent, prohibiting our doing malacha either on Shabbat or on the holidays, don't say much about what we're not allowed to do. They say you're not allowed to do malacha, but they don't say what malacha is. And if you go back to the Torah and even to the biblical texts that follow the Torah, you'll find that there's very little specification in the Bible about what work we are not permitted to do on the Sabbath and festivals. In the Torah, we're told we can't ignite fire. There's a story that says we're not allowed to gather wood. Again, small other details here and there. When we go on to the other biblical works, there seems to be a prohibition on trading or doing business, although the way that's expressed in the sources is you're not allowed to carry. The carrying prohibition is actually, in terms of its explicit mention, the most ancient and consistent of the prohibitions that we find connected to Shabbat. But it's not a system, right? I mean, don't do business. Okay. There are a lot of other things you could do. Don't light a fire and don't gather wood. There's not much more than that we've got from the biblical sources. And so to subsequent generations, it fell to interpret the prohibition. We've got interpretations in apocryphal writings. The Book of Jubilees, for example, interprets the Sabbath command and specifies labors that are forbidden. We've got one of the major Dead Sea Scrolls that does the same. But it's not until the text that you see in front of you, the Mishna Shabbat, that we've got a fully spelled out, elaborate system that exemplifies what do we mean by milacha. So this is the Mishnah of the rabbis. It comes to the form that we see here, not the translation, but the final form of the Mishnah in approximately the year 200 of the Common Era. And let's dive into it in detail, slowly. I want to interpret it without prejudice. Okay, so pretend, if you can, even if you've seen it many times, pretend that you've never seen it before. And let's ask, on its face, at the simplest level of meaning, what seems to be described here? So there's a translation of a very difficult Hebrew phrase. The translation here is generative categories of acts of labor, awkward, but it's because of the difficulty of the Hebrew. Avot malachot is the Hebrew, right? So literally the fathers or parents, meaning the head categories or category heads of the malachot, of work, are 40 less 1, and then the Mishnah goes on to elaborate them, and you can see it right here. So I'm just going to read it. You will notice that they are organized here. First of all, they are numbered. That's in order to designate to you what the 39 are. But in addition, they are organized on the page in kind of paragraphs where I believe paragraphs are appropriate. The organization is mine, right? So the prejudice of organization is actually my prejudice. You are welcome to challenge it, but I also invite you to consider it. So the generative categories of acts of labor are 40 less 1, and begins. One who sows, plows, reaps, binds sheaves, threshes, winnows, selects, and what that clearly means is fit from unfit produce, grinds, sifts, kneads, bakes. Now, I want to submit that everything in that list is related to each other and that they are not related to the next part of the Mishnah. But again, you're welcome to challenge that as we go on. So, question. First of all, does anything about this list puzzle you? And secondly, does this list describe anything to you that is identifiable? So, that's the open floor. Let's get responses in the chat to that. Can we do that, Julia?
Sure. I'll open the chat. Excuse me.
I just opened it.
Okay. And a couple, just before, just a couple of people pointed out that I think the sows is SOWS, right? As opposed to SEWS.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yes, thank you I'll make the correction on the original. I actually copied and pasted it from another translation without noticing that. So while I didn't catch the error wasn't mine.
We have many excellent spellers in our group. Yep. Okay, so you can see now how people are chiming in.
I can see that? I don't know. It's
yeah.
There it is. There's my chat. It's at the top of the page. So wait a second. So let me go back up. Let me see where the comments on this begin. So I said, so agriculture was the first response. Lee Handler says process for creating bread. Right, Colin Heyman, making bread from the beginning, farming and producing from what is farmed. Someone wants to know, what about tulips? We'll get to that. Food comes in here, producing challah. Maybe a little bit overly specific, but again, it goes back to what's already been said, forms of work in an agrarian society and so forth. I'm not seeing all of them, but I do see that a lot of this is working together. So I think that you have all, more or less, I can't see all the comments, arrived exactly at the point. If we want to read this in a literal way, then it's fair to say that what it's describing is the production of bread, right? From SOWS through plowing, sowing, reaping. There's some confusion about the order of the first couple, the first few in the different sources, but we can work that out. So binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, and so forth. This is making bread. First of all, letting the wheat grow or the grain grow, then processing the grain, processing it into flour, and from the flour making dough, which will then be baked into bread. So in a specific way, this is clearly about the production of bread, if we understand, as many societies have understood, including ancient and not so ancient Jewish societies, that when we speak about bread, we're talking about food. That bread, being the so-called staple of life, stands in for food in general. Then this will build the bridge between those of you who identified it as producing bread and those of you who identified it more generally as agricultural work going into the production of food. So either of those is a perfectly good explanation. So just to be specific, while there are 11 specifics here, another way of saying those 11 would actually be as one. So the first category of prohibited labor is the category that we might call production of food or production of bread. The work necessary for the production of food or the production of bread is number one. So am I missing anything essential we've got a bunch of things here. We'll come back to it. I think that a lot of what we'll see will return to it. Now let's go to the second paragraph or second list, if you will. So he who shears wool, washes it, beats it, dyes it, spins, weaves, makes two loops, weaves two loops, separates two threads, ties, unties, sews, here spelled correctly for the purpose, sews two stitches and tears in order to sew two stitches. So I asked the same question I did before. What is this describing?
All right, we've opened the chat again, and we did get several people asking, or I did at least, about the 40 minus 1 versus just saying 39. I don't know if you want to.
Okay, I'll say something about that. So I see making clothes but not getting dressed, women's work, making clothing, lashes, I'm curious about that, making clothes, creating textiles, which of course you then cut and sew into clothes. Someone's saying talit, that's one particular kind of garment. In the ancient world, it wasn't a separate ritual garment, so the rabbis would not actually have known of talit as a prayer shawl. For them, it would have been, what is that Roman, a toga. So yes, I mean, perfectly okay. And somebody says, I love it, garment district stuff. Exactly right. So clearly what you've got here is the production of cloth, which will then be processed. In order to process it into clothing, it's got to be cut. It's got to be, I've heard it's got to be woven, it's got to be cut, it's got to be sewn together. Sometimes people ask, why is it that you've got here tying and untying or sewing stitches and then tearing in order to sew? My response to that, for those of you who actually have been involved in this kind of work, is that, well, if you're going to make clothes fit, you're going to cut, you're going to make cloth, and you're going to cut cloth, and you're going to sew cloth, and you're going to get it wrong. Right, so you've got to then undo what you've put together and maybe do some alternative cutting or do some alternative sewing, but you're not going to be terribly successful as an individual making clothes unless you allow yourself the possibility separating in order to start again. Someone commented on it's not mentioning knitting. That's right. This is exemplifying the making of clothes, just as we might understand the first as the exemplifying of the making of food. It clearly is looking at one kind of cloth production, which is to use wool to create cloth that will be created actually on a loom, if you look at the technical meaning of the words. And that cloth then taken and made into clothes. So to step back into what we had before, where I took the first 11 and said another way of saying the 11 is 1. That is to say the work for production of food. Number 2 is from 12 to 24, that is. It's, I guess, therefore, 12 in number, is the work needed to create clothing. So category number 1 is food. Category number 2 is clothing. Let's go a little bit further. The next one is a shorter list. And you may object to it, and I'm going to just read it and allow you to kind of, do what we've just done, which is a quick response. And if someone wants to object to my putting it together, please do that. So 25, he who traps a deer, slaughters it, flays it, salts it, cures its hide, scrapes it, cuts it up, writes 2 letters, and erases 2 letters in order to write 2 letters. So I see Gilbert Rosen said, creating parchment to write upon. You came right to the point that I would make. Rivka says writing, but you've got to write on something, and that is what's described here as well. Why the salting? Salting is curing of the hide in order to provide, in order to create fine parchment, you've got to cure the hide properly. So you've got to, remove the hair, you've got to cure it. Salting is part of that process. Scraping away the hairs, of course, cutting it up, and so forth. So Dorina is saying, why did they have to prohibit every stage of this process separately? That's an excellent question, and we'll come back to it. It relates to the question of why 39. Why the answer to the question. So let me just give the first part of the answer to what Dorina said. The answer to the question of the 39 is we can only speculate, and we really don't know. Why don't they say 40 as opposed to 39? What's the magic of 39? Interestingly, this connects to a comment someone made before, though I think it's merely coincidence. And Sandrea says what happens to the meat. I'll get to that in a moment. The only other place we see 39 is in the number of lashes that are administered by the court to someone who's guilty of certain crimes. The Torah says the maximum number of lashes is 40. The rabbis say 40 minus 1, just like we've got here, because they want to make sure you don't make a mistake in counting, which anyone could easily make, and go over 40 to 41, which would transgress the Torah's limits. So they reduce the limit by 1. Why in the world would there be an association between lashes and what we've got here? No one can figure that out, but it's the only association that anyone knows. So why put this into these small categories when we really have very large categories? And in fact, very few of them. I'll come back to that because there's something the Talmud says about it that will be part of my answer. What happened to the meat is a really good question. The answer is, from this, we don't know, and evidently they didn't care. they already dealt with the production of food as a category, right? So you can do with the meat as you like. Sometimes the pushback that I get is, no, 25 through 31 is about processing meat, and you could sort of read it that way, although then the attention to the hide would be very curious. But when we see the way it leads to writing 2 letters and erasing 2 letters, it becomes clear that this is the production of parchments for writing. I want to add one thing to that, though, which is going to be very important for our discussion. They wrote on a variety of things, right? Parchment is expensive and it's difficult to produce. It's very durable, but it's also expensive because animal lives are expensive and difficult to produce, and particularly deer hide. Deer hide is very soft. It was considered to be the highest quality of hide. When we find elsewhere in rabbinic teachings, what's the best parchment to write Torah scrolls on? The answer is deer, even though you can write on other kinds of parchment as well. So it is, kind of the elevated, the preferred, and therefore what we've got here is not merely the production of material for writing, but I think it's fair to say the production of material for writing sacred scrolls. It's not about writing in general, it's about writing sacred scrolls. And we'll come back to that, okay? Now let's finish it out, because from this point onward, we no longer have lists that when we put them together, we can read as a kind of narrative. We've just from 34 to 39 got a few details. One who builds and tears down, though that's significant because, building is about shelter probably more than anything else. He who puts out a fire and kindles a fire, to be sure related to cooking, but also related to, in a way, to shelter, because there are seasons, even in the land of Israel, where you need fire to keep warm, where it's miserably, miserably cold without the fire. He who hits with a hammer, if you wanted to, therefore, you could put 34 through 38 together and say that it's about sheltering activities or shelter activities, although it doesn't represent itself in the kind of step-by-step process that we've got earlier. And then last but not least, in 39, we've got he who transports, or one who transports an object from one domain to another. This stands out. It doesn't relate to anything that comes before it. As I said, it is the most ancient and most consistent prohibition through biblical sources and beyond. So the rabbis couldn't conceivably leave it out. I mean, every Jewish community who had anything to say about prohibitions on the Sabbath included this, so the rabbis had to include it as well. It, again, might be representative of doing business, but I would actually just bracket it and say they had no choice but to include it. And what's significant about this list is not what they repeat from everybody else, which is number 39, but what they create themselves. This is the rabbinic description of what you're not permitted to do on the Sabbath. It is therefore their interpretation of work, right? The work you can't do on the Sabbath is the work you do during the week. So what we've got here is a detailed, and it is very detailed, rabbinic interpretation of the meaning of work. And so let me step back and say, as you look at this, therefore, how would you characterize the rabbi's interpretation of work? For the rabbis, what counts as work, at least as it pertains to the Sabbath? We'll see whether it goes beyond the Sabbath, but as a foundation, this is what we've got. Anybody?
We just opened the chat again if you want to respond to the question.
For the rabbis, what is work? Physical activities. I see that I would say far too broad, changing status. You've been reading other things and it's not what you find in the Mishnah. There's no way you would have come up with that from the Mishnah. Creativity, no way you would have come up with that from the Mishnah. Creation, no way you would have come up from the Mishnah. Let's stop for a moment. Okay, I'm rejecting a lot of answers here. Let me tell you why I'm rejecting them, right? Because I can hear in a lot of your comments things that you have learned elsewhere. And I asked you at the beginning, forget what you've learned elsewhere, right? There's very little here that you would construe as the general act of creativity. If it's creativity, it's a very special kind of activity. There's nothing here that you would construe as, you know, in the general way of physical activity. There are many, many, many things we do physically that aren't included on this list. Right? So if it was physical activity that was forbidden, or if it was creativity or changing the status of something, all things that you and I have learned from other teachers before, then this would have been expressed differently. So I happen to have Barbara Esring and Martin Kagan in front of me. It's now just gone down. Things we need to live and basic human needs is what I saw. And I want to say, I think that that gets exactly to the point. Think about what we mean when we say, and we all know this, right? So 3 of the 4 categories, as it were, is food, clothing, and shelter, right? We've got food, clothing, and shelter here. When you hear someone say food, clothing, and shelter, or when you see in writing food, clothing, and shelters, there's nothing here about money, Harriet. That's right, because who needs money? If you've got food and you got shelter, you don't need money. It depends whether you live in a money society or not. Food, clothing, and shelter, what does that mean? Right, we all know it constitutes the essential necessities of life. Without food, without something to cover our bodies, without shelter in the broader sense, we can't survive. And so the other way of saying this is the things that human beings need to survive. Right? Food, clothing, and shelter. Now, at this moment, you should be saying to me, but wait a second, you skipped numbers 25 through 33, which are the labors that are needed in order to create sacred scrolls. Here, what I would say quite simply is, let's not forget that it's rabbis who are creating this list. So if you ask normal people, what do you need to survive? Their answer will be, well, there are a lot of things I'd like, but essential, just survival provisions are food, clothing, and shelter. The rabbis would say, oh yeah, and you also need Torah. Right? As far as the rabbis are concerned, you can't survive without Torah, meaning sacred scrolls. So I actually would redouble my claim that this is exactly what the rabbis are claiming here. For them, work, the word malacha, means survival work, essential work, what you need to live, what you need to survive. And for the rabbis, that included not only what it meant for everybody else, food, clothing, and shelter, but it also meant sacred scrolls, because that was part of what they needed to survive and assumed that all Jews do. Now, I'm going to go a little bit further to show you that I'm not just inventing this, that actually the rabbis themselves are aware of what it is that we just discovered in these materials. So first, you'll see at the bottom of your page now that, 2 of the activities are kneading and baking, right? And on that, the Talmud says, said Rav Papa, the Tanaite before us, meaning the early Mishnaic period teacher, has neglected the boiling of ingredients for dyeing, right? There's no mention of that work, even though this took place in the building of the tabernacle, and instead treats baking, which didn't take place in the building of the tabernacle, right? So if you think of the tabernacle connection, which allegedly was the source, and Rav Papa, referring to an earlier teacher, knows that. He says, wait a second, if it's about what happened in the tabernacle, then why not give us the labors that were necessary to create the tabernacle? And the tabernacle, if you go back to the description, had a lot of curtains everywhere, and the curtains are described in the Torah as being absolutely magnificent in their dyed colors. But of course, in order to do that, you've got to create the dyes in order to steep the cloth in the dyes to create these magnificent curtains. And there's no mention of that here anywhere. And so the Talmud responds and says, oh no, what the Mishnah is doing here is actually following the order of baking bread. It's not giving us the labor that took place in to create the tabernacle. It's giving us the story of work that is needed to bake bread. Now, to take this a little bit further. Okay, this is a wonderful, wonderful teaching, what we see here. I love this. You can see this is from Talmud Brachot 58a. This is from a long list of blessings that once upon a time the rabbis thought we should recite, and we no longer do. So one of the blessings that the rabbis formulate, it's been long since forgotten, is a blessing when you see a large group of people. And there are various blessings that are suggested, and Ben Zoma, as you can see, had the experience of seeing a large group of people. So he saw a crowd on the steps of the Temple Mount. So, the great crowds that went to the temple, and he said, blessed is the one who is wise in knowing secrets. Okay, because every human being has their own secrets, and we don't know what those secrets are. So this is actually a blessing for the diversity of human thoughts. And then it goes on and says, blessed is the one who created all of these people to serve me. Now that sounds awful at first blush, but look at what this is actually an appreciation. So he goes on, he would say, how hard did Adam toil before he could taste a morsel of food? He seeded, plowed, reaped, collected sheaves, threshed, winnowed, separated, ground, sifted, kneaded, and baked, and only then could he eat. But I arise in the morning and I go to my local bakery and I buy what I would like and enjoy it thoroughly. He didn't say it in exactly those words, but you can see what he said. But I arise in the morning and find all these things ready before me. And then he continues, how hard did Adam have to work before he could put on a garment? He sheared, bleached, separated, dyed, spun, wove, and only then could he put it on. But I arise in the morning and find all of these things hanging in my closet, and I ordered them via Amazon from, I don't know, choose your favorite supplier and you get the basic idea. The point here is this isn't the full list from the Mishnah in Shabbat, but it doesn't need to be because they're making a point, right? And the point is that Adam had to do everything for himself. Pre-society humans needed to do everything for themselves. If you will, this is actually very similar to social contract theorists in early modernity who said, we got together and gave up some of our individual freedoms in order to be able to work together and rely upon one another. And that's what Ben Zoma is expressing appreciation of here. But you can see it's exactly the same labors that the Mishnah delineated, one of which is about baking bread, creating bread, and one of which is about producing clothing. So both of the sources we've just seen make it perfectly clear that the rabbis too knew what the lists in Mishna Shabbat were. They were not about what goes on in the tabernacle. They were about the work that you need to create the things that we need to survive. Survival work, if you will. So having seen all of these things, I've got one more source that I'm going to share with you to carry the conversation forward. But before doing that, I want to take a break, and this is a good time to allow for comments, questions, whatever it is you have. Julie, I found that, these things go by my eye very, very quickly as people add them. So maybe you can help pick out a few and share them verbally so that, I don't have to pick up everything here.
Yes, and we closed the public chat a while ago. So
okay, so now we'll invite it.
So well, I get questions. I get questions the entire hour and a half. It's a very on my toes kind of hour and a half of my life.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for your hard work.
Well, I would love to go back to the question that you actually highlighted before about, I think it was Darina, why all the, why is each step of the process listed, which, which is right where I went too, because right, as as a lot of people know, the rabbis extrapolate in each of these areas. So all kinds of things that we now think of as, or that are now kind of codified as being prohibited on Shabbat, have nothing to do with that category, right? Like killing a bug, or trapping a bug and taking it outside. When I was growing up, I learned you're not supposed to trap a bug and take it outside. You have to somehow coax it outside, right? So that's because that's hunting, but the hunting is the way you categorized it in the preparation of material for sacred scrolls. So the fact that they list out all those specifics, really complicates things for us.
Yeah, it makes Jewish life a heck of a lot more complicated. There is no doubt about that. And part of the answer to the question of why do they go into these details is because this is what rabbis do, right? And, we don't need to be any more complicated than that. Part of it is because they actually do want to make it clear that these are the stories of the creation of bread, food, right, clothing, shelter. The rabbis do not tell stories in the Mishnah and, in their legal materials. It depends where we are. But that's not the way they communicate. They communicate in exemplary, I'm about to say something dumb because it repeats itself, in exemplary examples, right? I mean, they communicate through choosing examples and often in the Mishnah in lists. Right. And the lists we are meant to read inductively. Right. So they don't say things like work necessary to produce bread. They don't communicate that way. They give a list of things that, clearly illustrates how bread is made. And as we read it, they want us to put it together and say, oh, that's about producing bread. Now, you're quite right. What winds up happening as a result of this specification, because each of these categories generates other prohibitions. And so there are a lot of prohibitions. But one of the things the rabbis do want to do, if these were the only things that were forbidden, Shabbat would actually be a pretty open time, right? I mean, there would be many, many, many things that, our engagement in them could be problematic that wouldn't be prohibited at all. And so the rabbis had a twofold approach. What we see here is their interpretation of what the Torah prohibits. But they also wanted to create a protected time and space that, well, actually, I'll do the translation from what we've got here. The way I often teach this, and it's not essential to what we're doing right now, is so for the rabbis, Shabbat is a ritual of it's a ritual of not doing the things you need to survive. But by definition, since these are the things you need to survive, right, you can't not do them. So what this does is to create a relationship between what comes before Shabbat and what you do on Shabbat. And this is why in the ancient world, and we see this clearly in several mentions from important ancient Jewish texts that we now call the New Testament, we see that Friday is described as preparation day. Right? Because what all of this means is that it's impossible to actually have Shabbat without preparing for it. Preparing for it is at least as important as not doing these things when it arrives, because you need to prepare your food, even though you need it to survive. You need to prepare your clothing. You need to prepare your shelter. And that leads to the question, when in human history, at least as far as the rabbis knew it, did humans have everything they needed provided for? Because that's what Sabbath is now, right? Everything you need is provided for you, because in the case of the Sabbath, we took care of it beforehand. The answer is the Garden of Eden, right? Or, the desert with God's protection, or the world to come. But let me take the Garden of Eden. The rabbis wanted the Sabbath to be a recreation of the Garden of Eden. And in order to do that, all of these things were essential, but more things were essential as well. And so they rounded this out with other prohibitions. But I do want to say, for those of you who think that the rabbinic Sabbath is only about prohibitions, if you go back to earlier rabbinic sources, to earlier Jewish sources, and compare the rabbis to the earlier Jewish sources, you'll find that the rabbis of the Talmudic period, at least, were actually what we might call Reform Jews, in the sense that there were earlier prohibitions that they found a way around. So every source before the rabbis prohibits carrying. The rabbis here record the carrying prohibition, but they then go on to invent the notion of eruv, and the rabbis did invent it. They didn't get it from anywhere. And through this invention, they made it possible for most Jews living in most communities to carry on Shabbat, even though it was technically forbidden. So part of the rabbinic Sabbath is about making things easier, more convivial, more community-oriented, and so forth. Okay, other comments or questions?
Several people asked about the connection to the Mishkan, which is what so many people, have learned, that the forbidden labors are those that were associated with the Mishkan, which now people are saying feels sort of in tension with that. It's a very different conceptual frame from the essentials, the way you're framing it now.
It is. It's very much in tension. I thoroughly agree. The rabbis knew both of those interpretations, though. I actually believe that this one, the one we have in front of us, is the primary one. They also speak about the association of the Mishkan, but when they spell out the details, it's more about this than it is the Mishkan. They rarely ask the Mishkan question, or actually, to say that a little bit more correctly, they don't actually care whether work was performed in the Mishkan. There's a very, very long discussion on a particular page of the Talmud of how we learn certain prohibitions connected to carrying in and carrying out and things like that. And they go back to the model of what happened with the tabernacle, with the Mishkan, and they try one way and they try the other way, and they literally spend a whole long Talmudic page not coming up with an answer. And in the end, they say, oh, it's a tradition. Right? So they don't care whether they can actually tie it back. They know what the prohibition needs to be. I think that what Heschel did with the Mishkan connection is what they would want us to do with it as well. So what I've done is take the notion of these work being, kind of basic subsistence work, and translated it into the garden. And then the question becomes, how do we recreate the Garden of Eden on Shabbat? What Heschel did was, right, how do we create sacred time on Shabbat? By suggesting that Shabbat is about the negation of sacred space and the affirmation of sacred time. They, are similar in their manner of final interpretation.
Thank you. That was really helpful for me. Right. So another thing that many people are mentioning is, and I think you actually said it, just about essential workers, or you said essential work, and it's it's hard not to go there. So people made various comments about that, but I wonder if you have a comment on this sort of 2,000-year-old essential work versus this whole new category that we've come upon in the last year and a half of essential labor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, we're wealthier than humans have ever been before, meaning that larger numbers of humans, including a very significant proportion of the Jewish community in the United States of America, is far wealthier than humans were before. And what I mean by wealthy here, I mean, wealthy is always a relative term, so I don't mean wealthy against the wealthy in our society. I mean wealthy in terms of what we can afford to do, or more particularly not to do. And in the pre-modern world, far more of us were engaged in the work of basic survival in one way or another. So, you know, the split would have been different before our own time. But what I would say is that given our collective wealth, and when I say this, I know people, I often get people when I make a comment like this who say, but there are poor Jews. And of course there are poor Jews, right? And we should not ignore poor Jews in the United States or elsewhere. However, right, I haven't seen the most recent statistics, but, you know, for a long time and until very recently, the Jewish community was, or has been over a long time, the wealthiest religious community in the United States, right? And when you look at household income, the Jewish community is the wealthiest community in the United States. And what I would say is that's wonderful, but we ought to take a lesson from Ben Zoma, right? And the lesson is, if we don't need to do the essential labor, right, then it is our obligation, it is incumbent upon us, just like Ben Zoma, to recall what we do not have to do, the luxury that we have, and appreciate in every sense of that term the work that we can take advantage of that is not done by us, but is instead done by others. I mean, one way this translates into my own personal practice is, you know, if you begrudge a tip, right, don't talk to me, right? Because whatever happens, these people are working far harder than we know how to work. Go ahead.
So Ben Zoma has a lot of fans in our group.
Yay, good. Many of you probably, well, I guess you know Ben Zoma from the Haggadah, but
no,
still.
from how you've presented him here, really.
Oh, good. Okay, go ahead.
So a challenge to that, and I think kind of a natural question with what you've been talking about is, so what about the prohibitions that in our time really it's hard to experience as anything other than restrictive, as opposed to, you know, creating this, you know, this time of kind of like Edenic freedom that you're talking about, which I think, you know.
So did people provide examples, or do you have an example?
One person gave an example of, you know, when you're in a place without an eruv, you know, not pushing a stroller, right? So here you are, and you're trying to go to shul or be with friends or family, and do you not take your baby? Do you have to schlep your baby on your back? Or I think we could probably all come up with different examples, the things that feel restrictive for us. But I would venture, venture a guess that you know, people leading, you know, a traditionally Shabbat observant life, at some point or another, you know, you find things restrictive. Or I didn't turn on the whatever before Shabbat, and now I can't, you know, I didn't put on the hot water, and now I can't have my coffee, and I have a headache all day. You know, however, the way these things play out, which then kind of right, takes away from that world of Eden that we're meant to be creating.
Well, whether it does or doesn't, I mean, I understand the question that you're asking. So let me try to answer it from a number of angles. First of all, you crucially use the word that I experience, or that we experience as restrictive, and that's key, right? Because what one person experiences as restrictive, another might not, right? So, you know, there's certain members of my household who would experience it as very restrictive not to be able to check various electronic feeds on their phones on Shabbat. I cannot think of anything more liberating, right? I mean, literally, keep it away from me. I turn off my phone before Shabbat begins. I don't turn it on till afterward. My soul rests the moment my phone is off. And it is something that I can't capture any other way. So to a significant degree, this is about experience, and experience is about training too, right? So, when people enter the Sabbath, enter Sabbath experience, they say, you mean I can't do this? You mean I can't do that? And I experienced this myself. I grew up in a household that wasn't Sabbath observant. And, I took on Shabbat, and I felt things to be restrictive, which I now later over time came to feel as protective. And this is the second point. We underestimate the importance of restrictions, which are at the same time protections. If you didn't turn off, if you didn't mute everybody here, right, it would be chaos, right? So what you've done is you've instituted a prohibition on verbal participation in this enterprise, right? And that protects the ability of all to actually get the greatest benefit from it. Those prohibitions, I mean, I used one example, but prohibitions are absolutely essential to creating a protected space and time. If you don't do that, then you will constantly be bombarded. You will constantly be transgressed. If you haven't erected the fence, right? If the fence is wide open, then all you will experience is the territory being transgressed. So I think the example of the infant stroller is a good one. And it's one that I don't have a good answer for, except to say, so, put up a damn eruv, because that's what the rabbis wanted you to do. If we go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they said, don't carry your children. What the rabbis said in response is, oh, of course, carry your children and bring a bottle of wine with you, right? But just put an eruv up first. And we know what an eruv is, right? So they didn't want to forget the prohibitions, but they wanted to make sure that they weren't onerous. That's the spirit of the Sabbath that I think the rabbis laid out when they created this Sabbath. And I think it was really important. I'm just going to artificially break here because there's one final source I want to share that will nuance what we've said, I think, in an interesting way. And then just go back to whatever comments people have. So you can see the final teaching here. There's a double negative, at least in thought here. So let me just explain it to you as I read it. So there's an early teaching, a Tanai teaching from the school or our household of Rabbi Ishmael. The verse says, you shall not do any work. That's a quotation from the version in the Ten Commandments, although it could be from elsewhere as well. Lo ta'asu kol malacha, right? So this is a negative statement, right? A negative to a negative statement is a positive, right? So it says, don't do work, excluding the sounding of a ram's horn, a shofar, and the removal of bread from the oven wall, both of which are acts of skill and not work, okay? So what this means to say is that according to the Torah's prohibition, the rabbis may then say, but we were going to change these things, but they admit to it if they want to change it. The Torah, they say, does not prohibit the blowing of a shofar on Shabbat, nor does it prohibit the removal of bread from the oven wall, because these are, the translation is an act of skill and not work. The Hebrew here that's translated as skill is chokhmah, wisdom, right? Or special skill, if you prefer. So what this says quite explicitly is that the fancy stuff, this is why, for example, creation work or creative work, right? The rabbis would reject that outright, right? Anybody who taught, whoever, has been on this, and I learned the same thing, that what's prohibited on Shabbat is creative work. The rabbis would reject that outright because, creative work, painting a painting, playing a violin, playing the piano, that kind of thing, explicitly that doesn't count as work. That's a special skill, nor even, and look how close they get here, the removal of bread from the oven wall. If you've never been in an Indian bakery or restaurant to see Indian bread made, where you can actually see them making it in the tandoori, in the tandoori oven, as we say, though that's like pizza pie. The skill of it is to, the dough is thrown onto the wall to bake where it sticks, and to remove it without ruining the bread is considered here to be a special skill. So while baking bread is prohibited, the removal of bread in the way that only artisans can do from the wall of an oven, so I would call this artisanal breaking of bread, that doesn't count as work, according to this, and that's rather explicit. And so coming back to the distinction we drew before, right, the work that the rabbis forbid is survival work, right? The work that everyone needs to somehow get done, either by themselves or for them, because without it, you don't survive. But the work that takes special skill, right? The examples they give is the shofar and this artisanal baking, those don't count as work. And so the Torah doesn't prohibit it. The rabbis might for other reasons, but they admit that the Torah doesn't prohibit it. What that means is that almost everything that most of the people, on this gathering have done in the past or still do would not count as prohibited Sabbath work as the rabbis understand the Torah. And this leaves us with very interesting possibilities, because back, Julia, to what you asked before about where it becomes restrictive and onerous, I've sometimes had people say, well, I would love to play the piano or play my instrument on Shabbat, and I find it really onerous that I can't. My response is, well, right, the Torah actually permits that. The rabbis don't, but if that contributes to your creation of your garden, then in the rabbinic spirit, what I would say is go right ahead. Because even though a halachic Jew in the fullest, strictest halachic sense might not do that, it corresponds both with the rabbis' reading of the Torah and with the spirit of what they create from the Torah. So I think this adds, some additional information to work with in our heads. And I want to go back to opening it up to comments and questions.
Most of the comments I'm getting are really on this same theme, and I think people are still I think everyone's absorbing what you just said, and also are still struggling with the idea of the things that seem to take away, the things that we want to do. And
give me more examples.
I've been getting a lot of examples.
Give me more examples, and I will reinterpret them for you. I'm going to turn it all around.
So crafting is one that has come up. Various kinds of crafts, which I really relate to. That's and someone has also just mentioned mental health and how these kinds of recreational activities, we know now are so important, for you're reducing stress and they're also communal, right? There's so many good, and you could say, Shabbistic kinds of things that,
right.
So, and I confess, my son, who's 9, he is so miserable not crafting. And I finally decided he's already deprived of all the devices and everything. And I just decided I want him to like Shabbat.
Sure.
So I decided to let him craft. So I look on with jealousy.
So the crafting example came from you again. Okay, I see.
No, it came from other people. But
I see.
I relate to it. Yeah.
Okay, so I have already answered the question of crafting. Crafting is a special skill, right? It's not subsistence work. And so I would say, if that is part of the way your garden is enhanced, go right ahead. That would be my personal response.
Okay, so you're reading that into the way you've shared this last source with us.
Absolutely. Okay. With respect to mental health, let me write a prescription, write prescription. That's what doctors do, right? Observe the Sabbath a little bit and tell me what it does for your mental health, right? My experience has been, and I know that of many, right? It is communal, right? It creates a protected garden. There are many other, some of the other words you used for it. To have a protected time and space like that, and to be able to go out and walk and commune, and I'll describe, it's actually interesting. The Sabbath comes with its rituals intended and not. And so there's something about the Sabbath that actually encourages certain kinds of rituals. So I, like others, I was here in the city. I lived not far from JTS in March of 2020, when we all shut down and retreated into our homes. And it quickly became clear that if we stay in our homes that way, and particularly in apartments, where we don't have the same kind of access to outdoors, it would really, drive us crazy. And so mental health came up here in a really serious way. And we could work from home, and there are other ways, we could get together by Zoom, but all of it was just inadequate. My wife and I are fortunate enough to live within a relatively easy walking distance of the so-called North Woods in Central Park. The best entrance to it is above the pond at about 103rd, 104th Street. You can walk over Great Hill at 106th Street, 105th, 106th Street as well. But the North Woods is an absolutely magical place. It's got stream and waterfalls, and it is one of the best bird watching and listening places along the entire East Coast, because it's a good place for birds to land when they're on their travels and they see this great big green swath, and it's the most protected place. And we began going there early every single Shabbat morning. We would get up early and go there, because it was so quiet and peaceful, and early on there was almost nobody there, and it literally became our Shabbat walk in the garden. And I don't think, there was no other day of the week we did that. Other days we allowed ourselves to get busy, to log on, to check our email, to sign up for Zoom programs, for things like that. And only on Shabbat, we couldn't do those other things. And so we had to get up and go out, and we created this wonderful ritual that enabled us to survive in a way that we otherwise could not have.
I just wanted to read the way one person articulated this, and you don't necessarily need to comment, but I thought it was worth sharing, from Harriet Katz. She pointed out that much of what we do for a living now isn't covered in these texts, while activities that were associated with kind of basic needs of living then are now recreational for a lot of us: sewing, baking, gardening. So I just thought that was an interesting observation, and maybe part of where we feel the tension here.
True.
Okay, so I'll just note, don't respond. The other example that everyone is bringing up about sort of the uncomfortable restrictions, they all have to do with music. You can comment if you want, but otherwise we can move off to a topic other than the restrictions, if you'd like.
Okay, I know. All I'll say here is, since I've used personal examples, is that from the time I moved to New York City, Upper West Side, which is when I began as a doctoral student here at JTS. I love and am deeply devoted to various kinds of music, and I would allow myself to pre-purchase tickets and walk to the Philharmonic, or to, in more recent times, jazz at Lincoln Center, or chamber music at Lincoln Center, or that kind of thing. I agree with what many people are saying. I don't happen to, play those instruments, but I do care deeply about listening to them, and they enhanced my experience.
All right, so perhaps surprisingly, the one thing, stepping away from this last theme, the one thing that has gotten the most pushback in your initial setup for us of the Mishnah from Shabbat is, the categorization that you provided
Mhm.
is about the writing. So
Mhm.
many people are, kind of unconvinced about, and we didn't talk about it too much, about the read, that this is about sacred scrolls, and
Mhm.
right, and there's all kinds of other things we do with writing, that right, we do business. People have mentioned a lot of different things, but I think fundamentally people are sort of struggling with that
Well,
argument.
that's true, but we don't do it on parchment, right? And we know that, I mean, if they did business, they didn't keep, unless they were wealthy or royal, they didn't keep business records on parchment. It's the fact that it's parchment and specifically deer hide that leads to that particular interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's tough because, I mean, your answer before was, it's there because they're rabbis, and that this is what they're concerned with, because it's right. It really is in stark contrast to the other things that really, as you
Yeah,
said,
yeah,
food,
it
clothing, and
is.
shelter.
It is.
Um,
I mean, listen, if business is there, it's in the carrying prohibition. I mean, that does need to be said. I mean, that is a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the carrying prohibition. Remember that even in modern Hebrew, in a different way, but in rabbinic Hebrew for sure, trade is masa'u matan, carrying and giving. Right, that is the phrase for trading. It's because it took place on wagons and horses and going in and out through gates and so forth. So it's reasonably interpreted as being there.
okay, great. And actually, people did also ask about carrying, which I think you said it's there because it was so pervasive they had to include it. But can you say a little bit more about? I mean, maybe you just said it. Maybe it's really about.
But yeah, if you go back to the biblical sources, right? So you find it in Jeremiah. There's a slight reference in Isaiah. Find it in the book of Nehemiah, explicit in all of those places. And then you look at post-biblical, what we now call apocryphal sources. In each of those places, the carrying prohibition is associated with trading. And so, I mean, there's no doubt that at the early stage, that's what it means. But this is one of those times where the rabbis and probably, well, actually, clearly Jews before the rabbis took the act and separated from its original meaning. So carrying was prohibited because it represented trade and trade was business. But then carrying became prohibited in and of itself, whether it was used for trade or not. I've got to say, it's actually an interesting thing. I mean, for those of you who engage, so let's talk about mindfulness rituals. Carrying is for the rabbis a mindfulness ritual, because if you open up Mishna Shabbat, and you can all do this if you like, go to Tractate Shabbat of the Mishnah in Sefaria online and read the first several chapters. Before Shabbat begins, you've got to go through the pockets of the garments you're wearing and make sure there's nothing in them, right? If you don't have an eruv. Now, remember, a lot of these things were rendered moot by the eruv, which the rabbis actually wanted us to build. They wanted eruvs, but the mindfulness of, oh, Shabbat is about to arrive, and one of the things I've got to do is see, what is my status? What is the status of my clothes? What am I, quote unquote, carrying along from the week, right? Do I have a receipt in one pocket? Do I have a bill in another pocket? Do I have money in another pocket? Do I have a tool? All of those things, right? You remove the residue of the week. Quite literally, you remove the residue of the week, and it cleanses us to move forward into Shabbat. So combine cleansing and mindfulness. Those are the words that we would use, but the rabbis got it. They instituted the practices before we invented the words for them.
So it's interesting because right, carrying is also associated with cooking, which is right. That's the main difference between Shabbat and holidays, is that we transfer flame and therefore cook, and then the carrying associated with food preparation and food sharing then becomes permitted. So, but I think guess I'm just trying to expand what you were just saying to holidays, right? So would you say, just along the lines of what you were just saying, is there kind of like a complete leaving behind of all of the stuff on Shabbat in a way that maybe there isn't altogether on
Listen,
holidays?
holidays are very different. They are, I mean, Shabbat, we've just been discussing at length. Holidays are about joy. The problem with joy is if you're doing the cooking, you've got a lot of work to do before you enjoy the next joy, right? And, for those of us who observe 2 days Yontif and then Shabbat, it's like, okay, really? First Seder's on Saturday night, the second Seder's on Sunday night. I've got to cook how much on Friday, that kind of thing. So, hopefully it contributes to joy, but I'm not sure work is the thing.
So we're out of time. This was such a wonderful session. I learned so much, and I know from the chat that that everyone did this, well, this is what Torah is like, right? We just started the Torah again this Shabbat. You can do it your whole life and never stop finding new insights. So this just such a fresh, ancient and fresh take on Shabbat. Thank you so much for kicking off this series in this way, and really pushing us to think about the nature of work. And I want to, on that note, just say that I hope we'll see everyone next week. Our session next week is with Dr. Sarit Katan Gribetz, who is a JTS alum and now a professor at Fordham, and she's outstanding. And her session is called Even God Makes Time for Leisure, Rabbinic Narratives About God's Work, Play, and Rest Schedule. So that should be fun and fascinating. And then after that, we'll get more into the the nuts and bolts of Jewish professions over the course of time. So thank you to everyone for coming today. Hope to see you again too. And thank you so much again to Professor Kraemer for teaching and kicking off the series. And thank you to our sponsor again. And we look forward to learning with all of you this fall.
Bye-bye, everybody.